Okay, so I decided to name my presentation Passions and Pivots because I feel that my journey has kind of been a kind of a merging of these two things. And so as I said to Meredith, it was just a real pleasure to explore these two things in putting this presentation together. And I so enjoyed kind of the reflection of it all. So it just happens to be International Women's Day. I'm sure that you all knew that, but I just wanted to wish everyone happy Women's Day. And it's just a great day to be sharing my story with you. So welcome. I always like to begin, especially when I'm doing Zooms, is just a Indigenous land acknowledgement. So I wanted to acknowledge with gratitude and respect the land and waters that I'm joining you from this afternoon are the unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan people, the territory, and I am grateful to live and work and play and learn in this beautiful, on this beautiful land. And I also always like to acknowledge with gratitude and respect the land and waters of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, where I was born and I lived and I was raised, and I raised my own children there. And so that's a place that's very close to my heart as well. So this is me. And I was a teacher in Vancouver for over 25 years. That was sort of my home and where my heart lies in terms of my practice, my profession. I am also a writer, and I write books for teachers specifically in the area of literacy. I present workshops locally and across the country and internationally. It's interesting that COVID kind of put a halt to, of course, all of the travel that was happening, and it's just slowly starting to pick up again. But I do appreciate the webinar venture because it allows me to kind of reach a wider audience, but not necessarily spending hours and hours in airports, which in winter is not that fun. I am the mother of two boys who are now young men. And one other thing about me is I love books. And by the time you're finished, we finish this afternoon, that will be very clear to you how much that's definitely one of my passions. So those are the books that I have written. As I mentioned, I wrote books on reading instruction and then writing instruction. And my most recent one was about teaching poetry. And so these are used in classrooms, and teachers, use them for their lessons, for their practicums. And I try to write books that are very user-friendly, and so that a seasoned teacher can use it or a beginning teacher can use it as well. My books have been translated into French. I'm not French speaking, which makes it a little awkward sometimes, but they are used for French immersion classes. My books have also been translated into Swedish, and I've done some work in Sweden, and also Chinese and Danish. The Danish cover, I have to say, is a little lacking in excitement, but it's got some weird fist coming out of the book, so I'm not quite sure what that means. But anyways, there it is. So as a teacher, I always like to have an agenda, or what we call, and Bonnie and Meredith will know this, shape of the day. And so this is not the shape of the whole day. It's just the shape of my workshop. But I'm going to introduce myself in a little bit more detail. I'll talk about my passions, my pivot moments, I call them. And then at the end, I'm going to just do a little insight and then some closing thoughts, and then we'll have time for questions. So I was born in Vancouver 100 years ago, I feel like. And that's where I've lived for all of my life until I made the move to Kelowna. So I miss Vancouver. It is sort of my heart and my home is there. And so while my house is in Kelowna now, I still feel there's a part of my home that's there. I am the youngest of 3 girls, so that's me and my 2 older sisters and my dear mother. And we were all very close in age, and my mother was from England, and she sewed all of our clothes and we matched. And when we went to school, we were called the Gear Girls. Here come the Gear Girls, all dressed exactly the same with the same haircut and the same clothes. But I had a wonderful childhood, and I'm still very close with my sisters. There we all are now. And so I did grow up in a very happy home. My father, born in Canada, but had very strong ties to Scotland. His family was Scottish. And so he, in his mind was all things Scots for my dad. And then my mother was born in England, and my dad was teaching there for a year. He did a 1-year transfer in a small town called Stalybridge. And that's where he met my mother. And then they got married and came back to Canada. So she basically left her family and her friends and came and started a life in Vancouver with him. So my dad was a principal, and Bonnie was one of his staff members, which is just so wild. But he started out being the head of the English department at Churchill High School. And then he moved into a position of vice principal. So he was at Kerrisdale, and then he moved to Southlands, and he was an Oppenheimer. So he was a principal at many schools across the Vancouver School District. But one thing that my dad, I think, gifted me with was his passion for books, literature, the poets, the classics. And he was passionate about words. He loved language and he loved words, and he would often, read Shakespeare aloud, and he had a huge collection of books. Talk about a bookshelf filled with classics. That was definitely him. My mom was a Sunday school teacher, and she was a housekeeper and raised us. But one of the things I remember that my mom gifted me with was this kind of, I guess you'd say, her sort of mantra about life. And I don't know if this is quoted word for word, but it's how I remember she would talk to us about. Your life is a story. It's just not written down. And everything you do in your life, you add a new chapter. Not all the chapters will be happy. Some will be sad, some scary, and some filled with adventure. But the best part is that you get to write your own story. And the more that you do in your life, the more exciting your story will become. And so this was a message she gave to us. And I think the message here that I took from it was, you've got to make the most with the time that you have, and you've got to get out there and just live your life and take risks and add those chapters, because if you don't do anything, you're going to have a really small book, not very interesting. So I always remembered that. That's what I passed down to my own 2 boys, this idea of experiencing life and writing your own story. So I went to Lord Kitchener Elementary School, and oh my goodness, I wrote Point Grey. I can't believe I wrote Point Grey. I went to Prince of Wales, and the reason I wrote Point Grey is that was the school my son went to. Anyways, I went to Prince of Wales High School. I'll have to fix that in the PowerPoint. And then after I graduated from high school, I went immediately to UBC, and I did my 4-year education degree. In those days, you didn't need a degree first and then get your education. It was actually a 4-year program. So I did that. And then I started about 5 or 6 years later, after I got my degree, I went back and got my master's at UBC. When I graduated from university, there were zero teaching jobs, like none. There were just, you couldn't even get on a sub list, and nowhere in the Lower Mainland could you. And so many of my good friends were kind of going away to teach. And I was very young, and I was not necessarily knowing any place in BC where I could go. And just coincidentally, at my mother's church, our church, our family church in Dunbar, there was a teacher there who, a woman there that went to the church, who used to teach at this girls' school in Tokyo. And she said they're looking for another teacher. And so, long story short, when I was very young, I was only 22, I hopped on a plane and I went to Japan. I didn't know how to speak Japanese, and I didn't know a soul, but I certainly added a great big adventure chapter to my life story. It was very scary for me because it was sort of my first teaching job, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I had the job of kind of being the token foreigner teacher, like the person who taught English. They had English Japanese teachers, but I was like the token foreigner. So I don't know if you know the school, Crofton House in Vancouver. It was a similar sort of prestige to Crofton House. It was the school that I was at. It was like a private girls' school from kindergarten to grade 12. So it was very prestigious. Anyways, I spent 3 years teaching English in Japan, and I traveled everywhere. A friend of mine came out, and that made it a little bit more enjoyable. And we just traveled around Asia on holidays. I came back to Vancouver a couple of times. But it was an incredible experience, and I'm so glad, I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity. Then I came back, and by that time there were more job openings in Vancouver. So I started applying, and I got on at General Brock, and I got on at so I started my career at General Brock School, and then I moved to Laura Secord. And then I did a 3 or 4 year position as a district mentor. That's where I met Meredith. So I was working with the sort of mentorship team, the literacy team at the school board. And then I ended my years in the school board at Sexsmith Elementary. So those were kind of my schools that I worked at. And honestly, I would tell you 100% that I'm in my happiest place when I'm sitting in front of a group of children. And that is my passion, my love. And I'll talk about this, but I was very fortunate in that I knew from the very, very beginning of my life that I wanted to be a teacher. And I know that that's not the case with a lot of people, but I just feel really grateful that I've had that, and it's never left me. And I've just loved my career working with children. So I met my husband, Richard. Richard's originally from Kelowna, and we got married, had 2 beautiful boys, very close in age as well, like my sisters and I. And this is very much part of my passion, is just all the things that we did together, especially camping and outdoors. And Meredith knows, because she would come sometimes and watch my boys on the soccer field. And we were a very busy family, but lots and lots and lots of great adventures. And that's them now. So they're all grown up and finished. One of them's finished university, and then just recently, just right in the middle of COVID, we sold our house in Vancouver and we moved to Kelowna. And that was really hard for me. It's still hard for me because Vancouver is really my home, but I'm making the most of being here. And I mean, it's a beautiful place. Oh my gosh, if you've been to the Okanagan, it's spectacular with all the lakes and the wine country. And we're sort of right in the middle of, and you know, it's funny because I've been up here before, but I never realized it, in fact, how long the Okanagan Lake is and how narrow it is. I just didn't ever realize it. So we're at a narrow part, sort of right in the middle of the lake. Of course, lots of wine country. It's wine country, so that's good too. So now I want to talk about my passions. That was just kind of a bit of an intro to my life, but now I really want to hone in on the things that I'm passionate about. And I think the passions have sort of been the driving force of all of the things that have unfolded for me. So first and foremost, my family has always been my passion. Was my passion as a child, you know, just that close-knit family and just the love that I have for my family now. So that's always family first. It's always been my thing. Even when I was busy writing books and doing workshops, that was always sort of at the top of my list. I love dogs. So there's my dog, Maggie. We've always had dogs in our family, and so I'm sort of passionate about that. I love camping and being in the outdoors, and we have spent many, many summers camping. My husband just bought this trailer or this little van, and so that's what we're going to be doing. We're out and about, you know, on the road with the camper. I like wine. So being in the Okanagan is a nice place to kind of be. And I love just being outdoors in the trails, in the woods, in the forest. I love hiking, very, very passionate about nature. And my favorite holiday is Christmas. So I'm also passionate about Christmas. I start thinking about Christmas, like as soon as it's over, I start thinking about the next one. So those are some of my personal passions. But there's one that I need to have on its own screen, and it's this. I love books. I love them. I've always loved them. I love the feel of them. I love the smell of them. I love opening up a brand new book, feeling that, you know, that crack of the cover. And I don't know what it is, but there's just something about a book that fills my soul. So that personal passion is also part of my professional passion, of course, as well. Here's a quote, one of my favorites. For the price of a bowl of soup, I bought today at an old bookshop a volume infinitely valuable, a boon, a prize, a priceless possession. All the way home on the train, I read it. I was enlarged, I acquired merit, I added to my life. And that just captures exactly how I feel about books, that you get that book and it just adds value to your life. Love it. I have been in a book club for 20 years. Those are my gals, and we had our 20th anniversary last spring. And we have an ongoing list of all the books we've read. So this is how much I love this book club. They meet every 5 weeks. I go to Vancouver for that weekend because I don't want to miss book club. So I'm very, very connected to these gals and to all those books that we've read. So that's how much I love books. Professional passions. Here's my man, Fred. The best teacher in the world is somebody who loves what he or she does and loves it in front of you. I love that quote so much because that's kind of how I feel. Like, I love teaching so much, and I got to do that every single day, like go to work and teach kids, and I loved it. And I keep thinking this and I keep saying it, I'm just so grateful that I found a job that I loved so much. And then this is also my professional passion. So this passion for books and literature that I really do credit my dad for, is completely spilled over into my professional life, being that that's kind of how I teach and how I use literature when I'm teaching. So there are two places that I go into where my heart races. Staples is one of them. And it's because if you're a teacher, you know that kind of like, you open the door and it's like this, okay, what am I going to buy? And it's kind of this excitement of the gel pens and the sticky notes and what kind of fancy paper can I have spent more money in that store on my classroom than like, I can't even tell you, but I love it. And the other place that I go into where my heart races is a bookstore. And I love independent bookstores. I love Mosaic Books in Kelowna. I love Monroe's in Victoria. I love Vancouver Kids Books. Like, I'm super passionate. And when I go into a bookstore, I could spend hours in there. So picture books have become literally the foundation of my teaching practice. And I call them my teaching partners. I never begin a reading or writing lesson without a picture book in my hand. And there is a picture book for every subject, for every topic, for every single thing that a teacher wants to teach. There is a book for that. And it's my quest to find the books, the perfect books for the lessons, and then share those book lists with teachers. Like, I want so much for children to love to read, and that joy of reading comes from being surrounded by amazing literature. So that's always been sort of my platform, is get the great books into the hands of the teachers so that they can then pass on that joy to their students. So I have a lot of book lists. I make book lists. Now publishing companies send me picture books because they want me to talk about them, and I do if I love the book. And so it's really an important piece to how my career has kind of unfolded, is just that love for books. So those are my passions. Now, what I want to try to do is give you a glimpse into what I call, this has been a really rewarding kind of reflection. And while I'm presenting mine, I really want you to be thinking about yours. Pivot moments are moments in your life that when they're actually happening, they may not seem significant or, important. But when you look back on them, you realize they were absolutely instrumental in the direction that you took in your life journey. And we all have them, but we just don't necessarily have the opportunity or the time to actually track them. And so that's why putting this presentation together has been just remarkable. That's why I keep thanking Meredith, because I was able to figure out, talk about your journey. There were moments that I can now put, it's almost like a puzzle pieces all coming together. So from the very beginning, when I was very small, this is not a picture of me because there wasn't a picture of me, but I played teacher. When I was 3 and 4, I would set up my teddies and I would give them all books and I would pretend to teach them. It was just something that I loved. And because my dad was an educator, I think, we were kind of surrounded by that. So that was something that I did. Here was a pivot moment for me. My dad brought home from school
Lacey, come.
an actual marking book and a red pen. Now, that does not seem significant to you, especially now we don't even use those mark books anymore. But this was such a gift to me. I couldn't have been more excited. I still remember I was probably 6. I still remember what that did. It's like, this is a real mark book and a real red pen. And so I wrote the names of all my teddies. And then and I know that seems kind of like not that exciting, but for me, it was like, I am a real teacher now. I can mark, I can use a red pen. And that was, I would say, the beginning pivot, a pivot moment in my life. My dad, and it's interesting, my dad has played a huge role in the pivots. Here was the next pivot. I was 8 and I had tonsillitis, and I got my tonsils out, and I was at home, not able to go to school, lying in bed. My dad comes home from work, and he comes into my room, which he didn't do a ton. It was usually my mom, and I was lying in bed. And he said, I stopped and I bought you something. And he gave me this. And that, again, like, I look back on that moment, completely changed my life. This was the very first book that I owned. And I couldn't even believe that my dad had bought it for me. But then I read it. And I was completely, I must have read it 10 times. I bought them all. We ended up with a whole collection. Little House on the Prairie, those books. And I don't know, we all have those books that we can think about as a child that were moments where we realized that we're readers. I'm an actual reader. And so that was huge for me, that being given my very first book, and I still have it. I kept all of those books. Another pivot is Robbie Burns Day. Now, my dad was Scottish heritage, and Robbie Burns Day was almost as big as Christmas in our family. And so he would pipe in the bagpipes, the haggis would come, and we would be in our kilts, and my mom would make this huge dinner. And I mean, it was a big celebration in my house. And then at the end of the meal, after we had our haggis and, you know, the whole thing, my dad would stand up at the head of the table and read Robbie Burns poems out loud. And I always remember sitting there going, you know, thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like, does he have to we've heard these 100 times. He read them last year. He's going to read them this year. And sometimes my sister and I would kick each other under the table. But I remember one time he was reading a poem that he must have read, like he's read it 100 times. And he started to cry. And I was like, what is going on? I don't think I remember ever seeing my dad cry. And I didn't realize at the time, but I think about it now a lot. He was so moved by those words that he had read 100 times. That's how passionate and impactful those words had that on him. And I think about that a lot. And I think about being moved to tears by someone's words. What a remarkable gift to be able to write like that. And also just to have that deep-rooted passion for language. Amazing pivot moment for me. Bonnie, you're up. Now, Bonnie, you are one of my pivot moments. And I'm going to just give you the heads up. I tried to get a really good picture from Lisa. I said, do you have a recent picture of Bonnie Dakin? And I didn't get the picture in time. She sent it to me, but I had already done my presentation. And so the picture I got of you is not very flattering. And it was actually one of the pictures I found on the internet where you were holding up some parking tickets. Do you remember that picture? I'm so sorry. So I took out the parking tickets, but you're not looking very happy. So I'm just giving you the heads up. This is not the Bonnie I knew. But when I was in grade 9 or 10 at Prince of Wales, we had, as all grade 10s needed to do, we needed to do volunteer hours. And because my dad was a principal at a school, he suggested that I maybe come and do my volunteer hours at the school. And he had the perfect teacher that would be more than happy to have me come in her room. Bonnie, this is not your room either. I don't think you realize the impact that had on me, because I had sort of this dream and this vision of being a teacher, but your classroom was the first one I'd ever been in. And your classroom was magical to me. I just wanted to be a student. I wanted to be 5 years old and I wanted to be in your room. And I sat so Bonnie gave me jobs. I was a master cutter. She would give me things to cut out and I would sit in a corner. But I just watched. I watched her teach and I watched those kids be so engaged with learning, with reading. They were singing and dancing and marching around the room, and you loved every single one of them. And that was a complete pivot moment for me when I look back on my becoming a teacher. You have no idea. I still can't believe that you're here. Anyway, because there's all these people here that aren't here. But anyways, I feel like I want to cry. I do. I'm getting all teary because you changed my life big time. Okay, stop crying. Okay, now I'm in university and I'm in second year and I'm taking a course by a woman named Claire Staub. Now, Claire Staub had this reputation at UBC for being someone who was very kind of hard-nosed, and also a bit strict. Also, she gave you lots of homework. And so, when you have, the rumors of these professors, anyway, and she'd written this book, Oral Language for Today's Classroom, Claire Staub. So there was a little bit of, kind of hesitation. That first class, you're sitting in the room and then you're just waiting for her to come in. So she walked into that classroom and she put her briefcase down and she sat on the edge of the chair and she took this book out of her briefcase and she started reading the first chapter of The Great Gilly Hopkins. And when you talk about pivot moments, again, huge. Here was this woman that I thought was like this hard-nosed education professor, and she's reading a chapter out of a novel. And I'm like, why is she doing that? And then you're just so engaged in that book. And she read for about half an hour. And we were all like, you could have heard a pin drop. And it was again, this magical moment where you're just like so engaged in that story. And then you realize, if you kind of take a step back, the power of a book to bring people together, to engage people, to just get people thinking. So huge pivot moment there for sure. And I have Claire Staub to thank, and I don't even know where to find her, but huge moment. The next is connected to this man, David Booth. Now, he is a Canadian educator from back east. He writes for the same publishing company I write for now. But David Booth was a person that I always kind of had heard about, and I knew he'd written books for teachers, and I knew he wrote picture books. But I my memory of him was attending my very first teachers conference. And it was probably my first year teaching or my second year teaching. And I remember going in there, and it was probably an auditorium with 500 people. And he stood on the stage and he did the same thing. He took out a picture book. And that was the picture book he took out, When I Was Young in the Mountains by Cynthia Ryland. And he read it. He read it out loud to us. And then he showed us a lesson of something that he had done with kids based on that book. And I remember sitting in that audience going, oh my goodness, books aren't just for reading to the kids. You can actually use them to do a lesson. And again, when you think of pivot moments, this was instrumental for me in the direction of how do you use a picture book effectively when you teach. Unbelievable. And I was so grateful to be able to meet him. This was about 5 years ago, and sadly he passed away just before COVID. And I'm so grateful. And I did tell him, I said to him, you have no idea, but I went to see you when I was my first year teaching, and you changed my life. So there he is. Love him. Here's another pivot moment, and it was a movie. And I think about this movie and watching it, and I've probably seen it 10 times or more since. But when I watched Robin Williams play this passionate teacher and how he impacted his students, I just remember watching it going, I want to be that teacher. I want to have such a great impact on my students that they will be better people, and that they'll go out into the world and live their life maybe in a different way. There was so much power in that movie to me, that one teacher could have such a significant impact. And this whole carpe diem, seize the day, was very much like how my mom used to talk to us, like, add a chapter, you got to get out there and seize the day. And so anyways, if I'm tracking my pivots, that was certainly one. Not as significant as Bonnie, but it was up there for sure. And then this is a really, really big pivot moment in my life. I was probably my third year teaching, and I had a class of ELL students, so all second language learners. And I was listening to a child read out loud. So they had come to my desk, and he was just reading a page. And he read a page to me, and he read with some degree of fluency. And then he said, I said to him, I'm just going to ask you a few questions about what you read. And I started asking him some questions, very simple questions about the story, and he couldn't answer any of them. Not one, like not even what's the boy's name. He read that book, but he had not engaged at all. And I said to him, aren't you thinking about the story when you read it? And he turned to me and said, what does thinking look like? And I couldn't answer him at that time. I just thought, that's such a weird question to ask. Like, what does thinking look like? Well, it doesn't look like anything. It's like up in your head, and it's happening when you're reading. Like I just didn't know how to answer it. But that question never left me, ever. It stayed with me forever. It's still part of everything. And I'll explain how it comes back, but I'm going to come back to that question, but it was huge. Then I'm going to do my master's at UBC, and I'm in a methodology and research and methodology course, and I hear about a man named David Pearson, and I learned about his research. And basically his research was looking at, what do good readers do when they read? What makes a proficient reader better than, like, someone else, what are they doing differently? And so his research at the time was quite groundbreaking, because he discovered that highly proficient readers were using strategies to help them make sense of a text, to help them engage. They were making connections, questioning, visualizing, inferring, determining importance, analyzing, and monitoring. And I remember listening to our professor talking about him, and, you know, it was a piece of research, but it did kind of strike me a little bit, because I found it interesting that he said, the most important thing here is not that my findings were because all the people in his study were good readers and they were all doing these things. He said, what I think is significant here is, if this is what good readers do, then this is what we need to teach every reader to do, because this doesn't happen naturally for everyone. So that was something at the time I didn't realize how important it was going to be. Now, I love this quote that from him: no matter how important code is, it's not the point of reading. So he was very much invested in what we call comprehension instruction, teaching kids how to think, not just giving them questions to answer at the end of a chapter. Now, I'm teaching at my school while I'm doing my master's, and Vancouver School Board had just initiated some reading assessments. And I remember my principal standing up at a staff meeting and saying, showing, I mean, this isn't the exact chart, but showing a chart like this and saying, this assessment has been very, very interesting. The scores for our school are showing some discrepancies. We have very strong decoders, but the comprehension is low. Our kids are not comprehending. So based on that assessment, we need to start working on comprehension. So I start thinking back to him, because I had just had this course. And then my principal said, our new school goal is we're going to improve comprehension. We're going to have a 3-year plan. And the first thing we need to do is form a committee. Who would like to be on the comprehension committee? Well, as soon as a principal says who'd like to be on a committee, everyone looks down and pretends that they, you know, have to go or whatever, shuffles papers and pretends they don't hear. But I put my hand up because I thought, I'll be on the committee. Well, I was the only person who put their hand up. I was the committee. So basically, it was my job to fix this problem just on the side of my desk while I'm doing my master's and teaching full time. And I wasn't married at the time, but it was like, okay, well, sure, I'll do it. But then I thought, well, what about if I use this research from David Pearson? Like, you know, he's saying we'll teach this stuff. So I remember going to my principal and explaining about David Pearson. And I remember him saying, oh, Adrienne, that sounds quite interesting. Why don't you run with it? Like, because he doesn't care, right? Why don't you run with it? But he goes, I will give you a little tip. That list is too long. No teacher's going to want to teach all of those things. Can you make the list a little shorter? And I said, sure. And so that's basically where reading power came from. It was all the stars aligned with me doing my master's, with Vancouver School Board, with our school having comprehension, you know, lower, and me putting my hand up and say, I'll do it. And so I just created this thing called reading power. I just literally called it reading power because it sounds more fun than comprehension instruction for kids. And I made the list shorter. Like he said, I picked 5, but it all came from David Pearson's research. And that's kind of where reading power came from. And this was a big part of it. I kept thinking about this little boy years before who'd said, what does thinking look like? So I wanted, because if you ask kids, what does thinking look like no one can draw a picture of thinking because it's like abstract. So this was really important to me. This was an important piece of this whole puzzle, was making thinking visible. So I remember drawing a few sketches on a napkin, and then I came up with this idea of like having a poster that shows what thinking looks like, so that when you're teaching connecting or questioning or visualizing, you can put the pieces up. So that little boy who asked me, what does thinking look like? And I couldn't answer. Now I can answer. This is what thinking looks like. Thinking is a connection, a question, a visual. It's just so interesting to have done this and seen where all this kind of came from. But really, all of these important people and things have made this impact. So lots of people, use reading power posters. They send me, these are lots of teachers use this. Famous people, reading power. This was a teacher up in the north on reserve in Yellowknife or something, and she said, I didn't have a poster. So she took photos of the kids. She said they're going to be their own posters. I love this picture. And the other important connection here with my passion was picture books. If you're teaching kids to make connections, for example, then why not give teachers a list of good books for connecting? If you're teaching visualizing, why not give? So this is where the Gear book list started coming, is I started suggesting books, and then libraries started making these tubs. And so it helped the teachers, helped the kids, made all of it accessible. So for example, if you're teaching connecting, books about family and friendship. And so these are some of what I would call connect books. Books about bullying, books about friendships, books about, My Mom Is Trying to Ruin My Life is the perfect book to read to grade 4s, because right around grade 4 is when you get embarrassed when your mom kisses you in front of your friends, right? So that's a great book. But I would never read that to kindergartens because they all want to marry their mom. So you have to be careful when you are choosing books for different age groups. This one's so good. Jamie Lee Curtis, the actress, she's got some great picture books. This one, Me, My Selfie, and I, it's about a mom who's obsessed with taking selfies everywhere they go. Every time I read this book, the kids are like, oh, I'm making a connection. That's like my mom. That's like my mom. It's kind of funny. Okay, here's another pivot. And Meredith knows this woman well. Jan Wells was a literacy consultant at the Vancouver School Board. Sadly, Jan passed away many years ago. But when she was working at the school board, she came and visited my school. And she came in to watch me teach. And I was doing probably a connect lesson. And she said, I'd love you to share your comprehension idea at an after-school workshop. And I said, I've never given a workshop before. I'm not sure I'd know what to do. And you know what she said to me? You'll be fine. Just tell your story. And I did. I got up and she was amazing. She totally mentored me. She took me there. We drove together. She set me up. She sat almost beside me. She was such a support. I was so nervous. And 20 years later, here I am giving workshops all over the place. I've given hundreds, and I do credit her for getting me on that path, because had she not come to the school and asked me, I don't know if I'd be giving workshops. So very significant that she and I met, and that she saw something in me, and I'm always grateful to her for that. Many workshops later, somebody said, well, why don't you just write it all down? Why don't you write a book? And so I proposed a plan to Pembroke Publishing, And at first they said, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. It's quite great. We would like to maybe pursue this. And then about 3 months later, I got a letter saying, actually, we don't think we're going to pursue this. And I was gutted. And everyone tells the story, you send your work off to publishers and there's all these disappointments. It was monumentally disappointing because I had sort of told everyone I was going to get published, and then I wasn't. But Mary Machuzi, Meredith knows Meredith, you and I have so many connections here. Mary Machuzi, who is the co-founder of Pembroke, she met me and we had breakfast at the Sylvia Hotel. This was probably, 6 months after I'd got the letter. And she said, I believe in you. You've got all the content. You just need to add your story. And so I started getting these. It's so interesting now when you look back on this notion of you need your story. You have to add your story. It can't just be that literal piece. So that was a pivot. So I wrote my first book, Reading Power, and it came out, and it was, so exciting to have that book out. And I've since done a second edition. You can buy it on Amazon, but I'm just showing you this because it's so hysterical. If you go on Amazon and look up my book, it's written by a different person. It says like Vesna something. It's so weird. Like it's not me, even though it says me on the cover. And so my publishing companies asked Amazon like 3 times, can you fix that? And they still don't fix it. Anyways, it's kind of funny. I thought I'd show that. Then somebody said, what about nonfiction? So I wrote nonfiction. And then a little while later, someone said, well, what about writing? So I wrote a few books on writing. And then what about poetry? So I wrote a poetry book. And the last thing I want to share is just how do you find time to write the books? Because I often get that, like I'm teaching full time, I'm mentoring, I'm giving workshops, and I have my family. And I always say, well, it's pretty easy if you have 2 sons who play a lot of hockey. And literally, I wrote 80% of my books in hockey rinks. I would go to the morning practice, I'd bring my laptop, and never at the games, but there were so many practices, and I would just sit and type my books. So that's how. And the other thing is just interesting about the process of writing. So literally what happens for me when I'm writing is I have the book in my head and it's up there, and it takes up so much real estate that I can't even remember like where I parked my car. So for me, the process of writing is like this huge release. Like literally, it is like emptying my brain out onto the paper. So I know lots of people, I talk to other writers, they have completely different experiences about writing. Some people say, well, they start writing before their idea is kind of actually generated. I'm totally the opposite. It's like, it's up here and then it's just about whoosh, getting it out. Okay, so I'm kind of done, but I just have 2 more slides because what I wanted to share with you is after I went through this whole journey to put this presentation together, I thought, well, I can't just end here. I need to do some kind of little bit of insight. And this is mostly, well, is for me, but also just, I wanted to see what were some patterns here. I'm all about the analysis. And so when I think about some of these pivot moments, my dad and my mom, what she said, and the book, and, all these kind of moments, the pivot moments, what I started to notice is how much they're centered around this metaphor of story, and really just that idea of story and how our life is a story, but I also found my way through story. And so I love that. I love that all these moments, all these pivot moments in my life, somehow I could kind of tie them back to story. And I'm just in the middle of reading this a very, very good book, especially as a non-Indigenous teacher who's trying to teach Indigenous concepts. I just love this quote: "One way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early or along the way, or we are also living the stories we planted, knowing or unknowingly, in ourselves. We live stories that either give our lives meaning or negate it with meaninglessness. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly, we change our lives." And I just think that's a very powerful statement about story. And Indigenous peoples have that whole concept of life as story, and that oral tradition. And then the other thing that I just wanted to share is really the idea of pivot people. And when I think about my story, how these people have had such significant impact on me and my journey and my life and how it's turned out, and me being a writer and being a presenter and being a teacher, and all the people that, when I think about along the way, have impacted what I've become, and the gratitude I feel for all of them. And just, so I just wanted to share that. So my final thoughts are this. I think the value that I gained from putting this together, I want you to experience it. So the first thing I encourage you to do is notice, name, celebrate, and follow your passions. I think all of us do to some extent, but really try to dig deep to find them and then follow them. And I'm going to say Meredith is someone who always inspires me to this effect because of how she lives her life. Meredith, I know you don't know this, but because I follow you and I see all of you live an extraordinarily full life, and that's very inspirational to me. Reflect. This was such a great experience to reflect on my pivot moments. Think back to those moments that you don't even know had such an impact on your life. What moments in your life have directly or indirectly changed the course of your life or changed your path? And then think about your pivot people. Who are they? Name them and thank them. And unfortunately, some of mine are not around. They're not here anymore to thank, but I'm going to have a big cry after about Bonnie being actually here. Amazing. And then just, if we think about our life as a story, and we're adding chapters as we go, and we all recognize not all the chapters are happy, and they're not all, flowers and unicorns, but all those chapters are what we draw from, right? Those chapters are what we go back to. Those are our connections that we make. So anyways, I'm so grateful I've had this opportunity. I just have enjoyed the process of putting this together. I hope you enjoyed it too. I don't know if it was like super boring or not, but Meredith, thank you for inviting me. I really do feel like this has been very rewarding for me to do this, to put this together. But I thought to myself, wouldn't it be kind of cool to have everyone have a chance to kind of like share their stories? And, you don't need a speaker to come in. You've got amazing stories within your network. So I don't know. I just thought that would be kind of a fun thing to do. Anyways, that's the end.